to remember all the by heart stuff that we memorize. I'm pretty sure that at the time we were learning all these bits and pieces of life, we were totally involved in them. We learned them so well that they were part of our very existence. But then all too soon, the memory of them seemed to disappear. They disappeared from our memories because we just didn't need to remember them anymore. All that stuff is still there. It's tucked away in our minds. It's just that it's been pushed back to make room for all the other stuff that's cluttered our brains. But you know, I think there are some things that we will always know, not just because they were memorized, but because they are truly meaningful parts of our lives that we know by heart. In a few weeks, my younger son, Chris, will be celebrating a birthday. I remember every detail of the day he was born, and I have his newborn face memorized by heart, and I see it every time I see him, even though he's in his 40s. That's often how it is with parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren. We will always have our loved ones with us by heart. And those memories are written on our hearts, and they are the ones that will always be with us. Now, the passage that Kathy read to us this morning from Jeremiah was spoken to the people of Judah. The words were meant to remind everyone that they should remember God and God's promise to them, made by heart. Unfortunately, that's not what the people were remembering. They have forgotten a lot of those things that we've been talking about during these weeks of Lent. People had forgotten how God had promised to never again destroy the world by flood. They had forgotten the covenant God made with their ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. These folks could no longer remember the old story of slavery in Egypt and God's promise to free them and bring them to a place of safety. They didn't even bother to remember those commandments they had to memorize as children. And they had no clue about the story we heard last week about the snake on the stick that had saved so many of their ancestors' lives. Indeed, all of those promises of God that had been memorized over the years were erased by a whole lot of other stuff, like worshiping idol gods such as Baal. It turned out that idol worship was a whole lot easier because those idol gods didn't make any demands on people. Idol worship made injustice and corruption okay. People who had power and control took advantage of the less fortunate, and no one held them accountable. Certainly, gods made of stone and metal didn't care about living life according to the rules Moses received from God. Life was great when no one really cared about God, how God wanted the community to live. Every person for oneself was going along just fine, thank you very much. Ignoring God's promises for living in right relationship with each other was okay as far as the people of Israel were concerned. But then along came the prophet Jeremiah, who demanded that people get themselves turned around before it was too late. Jeremiah knew that bad things were going to happen to the Israelites, and he did his very best to warn people. Unfortunately, Jeremiah, who went around wailing and smashing pots all over the place, often found himself in jail. You see, Jeremiah was a threat to the good life everyone was enjoying, and no one wanted to hear the bad news of death and destruction that Jeremiah was shouting about. All of those warnings were just a whole lot of needless noise as far as people were concerned. But The truth was that disaster was about to strike the people of Judah. Now, the people of the northern part of Israel had already been overrun by the Assyrians, and now for the Judean people of the south, the Babylonians were within striking distance. And just as Jeremiah had predicted, the people of Judah were hauled off into exile in Babylon. Yet in this moment of disaster, instead of Jeremiah declaring, "I told you so," Jeremiah speaks words of comfort and assurance. Jeremiah knows that the ancient promises God made to Noah, Abraham, and the Hebrew slaves in Egypt will be kept one more time. And this time, God's promise goes even further. This time, the promise isn't an external one made to a whole people this time. The promise is an intimate and personal promise. It's a promise made to each one of us, and it's as close as a heartbeat. That's today's promise from God. God promises to remember us by heart forever. No matter how many times we choose to be unfaithful or decide to worship other gods, no matter how many times we forget God, God will still remember us. And that's not all God promised the people of Judah. God also promised to wipe the slate clean and to start all over and over again. That's what God said through the prophet Jeremiah. No matter how many times we turn our backs on God, no matter how many times we forget what God has written on our hearts, God will start over with us. And that's what Jesus was talking about that day that Philip and Andrew announced, that said folks had come to see Jesus. Now, if you can find one these days, you might want to walk into an actual bookstore and check out the religion section. You should see an array of Bibles and devotional books along with biblical commentaries. And after you browse through that section, look to your right or left, and I'm sure you're going to find the spirituality section. There you'll find books with titles such as The Journey to Wholeness, Essential Spirituality, or How to Make Your Dreams Come True. And of course, if you happen to tune in to any morning show on television, you're bound to hear so-called experts telling us all about their latest book that gives us wonderful insights about how to have the perfect life in 5 easy steps. One writer puts it this way: we're on a human quest to search for fulfillment. We are looking for quick answers to the mysteries of life, such as why do bad things happen to good people? Where will I find peace and happiness? How can I make sense out of a seemingly senseless world? Well, guess what? We aren't the first people who are searching for a quick fix that will make our dreams come true. And according to our gospel story this morning, some Greeks were looking for Jesus. Perhaps they were on a quest of their own. These Greeks or Gentiles had come to Jerusalem for Passover. Now, we don't know exactly what they said to Philip, but it might have gone something like this. We want to see Jesus. You know, the guy who turned water into wine, made the blind man see, and the lame man pick up his mat and walk. We've heard this guy, Jesus, fed thousands of people with just 2 little fish and 5 loaves of bread. You know, the same fellow who walked on water and brought that man Lazarus back to life? We know that if we can just see him, our questions will be answered. We'll finally have a quick fix for all of our problems, and our dreams will come true. So what do you think? Will you introduce us to Jesus? Unfortunately, the Jesus they met didn't quite measure up to their idea of Mr. Fix-It. By the time today's gospel story rolls around, Jesus understood that his time here on earth was just about up, and that he would soon be lifted up on a cross to die. Somehow, Jesus knew he had to find a way to get through to those of us who are determined to have our dreams come true. That's why he told this story about a grain of wheat and how, if it isn't buried in the ground, it just shrivels up and dies. Here's what I think Jesus wants us to learn. We're expected to respond to God's forgiving love. Because if we don't, we'll just end up being shriveled up and die like that grain of wheat lying around on the top of the ground. You know how it goes. Seeds need to be planted in the ground. They need to be buried and nourished, watered and tended to, in order to take root and grow. Seeds are just seeds until they're planted and looked after. Our lives will never take root or sprout and grow unless we're willing to be transformed by God's love. And it's a transformation that's written on our hearts, just as Jeremiah told the ancient people of Judah. The transformation grows from inside us and sprouts up and out as we live in the light of God. Yet all this amazing transformation requires a risk on our part. Sadly, many of us may decide the risk just isn't worth the effort, and so we choose to lie around on top of the ground. We choose to keep our lives comfortable and secure, just the way they are. But Jesus reminds us that when we choose to do that, we'll shrivel up and wither away. Barbara Brown Taylor, an author and pastor, says this: what Jesus was trying to tell us is that we do everything in our power to protect our lives just the way they are. If we successfully prevent change, prevent conflict, prevent pain, then at the end we'll find that we have no life at all. We could choose to hate all the ways we cheapen our lives by chasing comfort, safety, and superiority in this world. We could choose to get rid of all of those things that keep us lying around on the top of the ground without being planted. In other words, if we dare to risk everything and plant ourselves in God's redeeming love, there will be no end to the true abundance of our lives. Jesus showed us that himself. He could have chosen the way of self-protection. Jesus could have stopped walking around in the open and gone underground. He could have slept every night in a different hideout. He could have toned down his message, made it more appealing to the church leaders and those in control. He could have shown more respect for the established church and its burdensome rules. Jesus could have stopped eating with all of those outcasts and marginalized people. Jesus could have done all of those things and been safe and secure. He loved his life just the way it was and chose to preserve it. He could have. But he knew that if he did all that, he would just be like that little grain of wheat lying around on the top of the ground. He'd wither up and disappear, die, without having lived to life to its fullest. Yet we know that's not what Jesus chose to do. Instead, he kept at it. He continued to challenge the authorities, the powerful people who practiced the letter of the law, but forgot its message. We've talked before about the people Jesus dealt with, who wore masks of self-righteousness and self-indulgence. Jesus walked around in the open, tearing away those masks, and in the end, he suffered for that choice. The suffering of Jesus was the fulfillment of God's will for Jesus. Jesus knew that unless he died and was buried, there would be no life for us. In order for a seed to do what it was meant to do, it must be given up to the earth. And in that giving up, the seed is transformed. We can dig and dig around in the ground looking for that seed and never find it. It gave up its life so there could be more wheat in the world. If Jesus had chosen to save his life, to write a few books and go on a speaking tour that promised everyone's dreams would come true, his movement might have lasted about 100 years. But that's not what he did. Because Jesus was willing to lose his life, because he chose to show us what life means instead of just telling us. Because of all that, we have been fed by the wheat Jesus planted for us. Jesus chose to show us what giving up comfortable and secure lives really means. He chose to show us that by taking the risk of living with God's love on our hearts, we too can be transformed to what God expects us to be. God promises to us, and that is written on our heart, is that one day we will change from the inside out. That is, if we choose to risk it all and follow Christ. So this week, go out and plant some seeds. And remember that God's forgiving and transforming love is very close. It's as close as the beat of your heart. Amen.
Pastor?
Yes.
I'm joyful that we were spared the tornado
Yes.
this week.
Thank you, Annette. And that brings us to